Three things that have nothing to do with each other. Why did a group of Benedictine monks in Louisiana face fines and the threat of jail time for selling a plain wooden box? What does a register of who married whom in medieval Venice have to do with the price of a subway tunnel under 2nd Avenue? And why did one agency in Washington spend 40 years receiving applications from people who wanted to start an airline, close to 80 of them, and approve not a single one? Those are the same story, the same mechanism, running in 3 centuries on 3 continents, and it was written down in 1982 by the son of Norwegian farmers from North Dakota. Hostile economists have been trying to kill it for 4 decades, and it keeps surviving. It explains why the countries that were flattened in the Second World War outgrew the country that won it, and it explains why the wealthiest society in human history can no longer build a railway. He never found a cure for it. He was still looking on the afternoon he collapsed outside his own office, 28 days after his 66th birthday. Get comfortable, this one runs long. Stay to the end, because by then you will understand why the safest decades in a country's life are the ones in which the damage accumulates fastest. Ad-free episodes live on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which sits behind this channel and a handful of others like it, plus early access and the research archive. Subscribe or join if you haven't. Let's start where it started. In the autumn of 1946, an American army of occupation carried out the largest confiscation of private property in the history of the United States government, and it carried it out in a country it had spent the previous 3 years burning to the ground. The instrument was the Agricultural Land Reform Law, passed in October of 1946 under the direction of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, which was the formal name for the occupation government that Douglas MacArthur ran out of an insurance building in central Tokyo. The law compelled Japanese landlords to sell almost everything they owned above a very small threshold. Roughly 2 million hectares of farmland changed hands, which is somewhere near 5 million acres, and it went to something over 3 million tenant farming households who had been working that soil for other men for as long as anyone could remember. Before the war, close to 46% of Japanese farmland was worked by tenants. By 1950, it was down to about 10%. The landlords were compensated. That is the detail everybody skips. They were compensated in yen, at prices fixed by statute, in the middle of the worst inflation in modern Japanese history. By the time the payments actually cleared, the money that a family received for land their ancestors had held for 200 years had been reduced to something historians have compared to the black market price of a carton of cigarettes. It was a purchase in the same way that a mugging is a transaction. 7,000 miles away, in the ruins of Western Germany. The occupation authorities were doing something structurally identical with a different target. They took Ig Farben, the chemical combine that had built the German war economy, and they cut it apart into the companies we now call BASF and Bayer and Hoechst. They went after the coal and steel cartels. They wrote decartelization law and they enforced it. And in June of 1948, a former marketing professor named Ludwig Erhard destroyed the German currency and replaced it overnight, and on the same weekend he abolished most of the price controls that had governed German economic life since the 1930s. He did not have the authority to do that. The story he told afterwards was that he had waited for a Sunday, because on a Sunday, the American general who could have countermanded him was not at his desk. These were the losers. These were the two societies that had been defeated, occupied, stripped of sovereignty, subjected to foreign law, and physically flattened. And within 15 years, they were beating the winners so badly that economists had to invent new vocabulary for it. Between 1950 and 1962, West German national income grew at a compounding rate of more than 7% a year. Over the same period, the United Kingdom, which had won, managed 2.29%. Japan, over the long post-war expansion, ran at something close to 10% a year for 2 decades, a rate no large industrial economy had ever sustained before. Now hold those numbers still for a second and look at what does not fit. Britain was not poor. Britain had the largest empire on the planet, a reserve currency, an intact financial system, a scientific establishment that had just produced radar and jet engines and the first programmable computers, and a manufacturing base that had been damaged but never destroyed. Britain received more Marshall Plan money than West Germany did. Britain won the war and came out of it with the worst growth performance of any major economy in Western Europe for the next 30 years. You have almost certainly been handed an explanation for this. There are 3 standard ones, and they are all in the textbooks, and they all have a hole in them. The first is reconstruction. The idea that Germany and Japan grew fast because they were starting from a bombed-out base, and it is easy to grow when you have nothing. The problem is that physical capital is the fastest thing in an economy to replace. Factories are steel and concrete and machine tools. A determined country rebuilds them in 5 to 8 years. The German and Japanese growth surges did not last 5 years. They lasted 25, and they were still going long after the physical capital stock had passed its pre-war peak. The second is the Marshall Plan. American money is the engine. That one dies on contact with the numbers, because Britain received more of it and grew slower, and because the total value of Marshall aid to Germany was a small single-digit fraction of German national output in the years it arrived. Money that size does not produce a 2-decade miracle. If it did, foreign aid would have solved global poverty by 1970. The third is convergence. Poorer countries catch up to richer ones because it is easier to copy a technology than to invent it. That one is real, and I want to be honest that it explains a substantial part of what happened, and we are going to come back to it because it is the strongest objection to everything I am about to tell you. But convergence does not explain Britain. Britain was not at the technological frontier either. Britain had every opportunity to copy the same American production methods that Germany was copying, and Britain sat there and did not do it, and British industrialists complained about it in public, in writing, for 30 years. There is a fourth explanation. It was published in 1982 by a man who grew up on a farm outside a town of 400 people in North Dakota, and it says that the thing the war destroyed in Germany and Japan was not the factories. The factories were the cheap part. What the bombing and the occupation and the defeat and the humiliation destroyed was a layer of social machinery that had taken 60 or 70 years to accumulate. That was completely invisible on any balance sheet, that no statistical agency measured, and that Britain still had every single piece of. And the argument goes further than that, which is where it stops being an interesting historical footnote and starts being something that should worry you personally. The argument is that this layer of machinery grows back, always, everywhere, that it grows back fastest in exactly the conditions we spend our entire political lives trying to create, which is peace, stability, secure property rights, the rule of law, and continuity of government. That the accumulation is silent, that it is composed of things that individually look reasonable and defensible and often genuinely just, and that by the time it is heavy enough to feel, it is far too heavy to lift. The question I want to hold open for the next 2 hours is not whether that is true. A surprising amount of it has been tested and holds up. The question is the one that the man who wrote it never answered, that the 4 decades of economists who tested his work never answered, and that nobody working today has answered either. If a society only sheds this load when something catastrophic happens to it, what exactly is a stable, wealthy, peaceful country supposed to do? Hold that. Because every time somebody in this story tries to answer it, the answer falls apart in their hands, and the way it falls apart is more interesting than the answer would have been. His name was Mancur Olson Jr. He was born on the 22nd of January, 1932, in Grand Forks, North Dakota, into a family of Norwegian immigrant farmers, and he grew up near Buxton, which sits in the flat country close to the Minnesota line. The first name was not a typo, and he got asked about it constantly. He said it was reasonably common in Scandinavian immigrant communities in North America, and that it descended from the Arabic name Mansur, which had travelled north through Europe and arrived in the Red River Valley attached to a man who milked cows. He went to what was then North Dakota Agricultural College. He got a Rhodes Scholarship, which took him to University College, Oxford, in 1954. He came back and did a doctorate at Harvard, and the dissertation he wrote there became a book called The Logic of Collective Action, published by Harvard University Press in 1965, and that book is the reason everything else in this story exists. Here is what makes his position unusual, and I want to establish it early because it kills a lazy objection that people reach for the moment they hear where this argument goes. Olson was not a movement conservative. He was not a libertarian pamphleteer. He was not funded by anybody with a stake in the conclusion. Between 1967 and 1969, in the middle of the most ambitious expansion of the American welfare state since the New Deal, Mancur Olson served in the Johnson administration as a Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Health, Education and Welfare. He worked on the problem of social indicators, which was the effort to build statistical measures of national well-being that went beyond output. He was, in other words, a man hired to help the federal government understand whether its programs were making people better off, and he took the job seriously, and he did it from the inside. James Buchanan, who was about as far from Olson politically as a fellow economist could get, and who won a Nobel Prize for work in the same field, described him after his death as an enthusiast for basic ideas, a man who engaged directly and who conveyed the conviction that other people's ideas mattered as much as his own. Olson is the man who coined the term Virginia School to describe Buchanan's own tradition, which is a slightly strange thing to do if you are a partisan of it. I am telling you this now, and not later, because the conclusion of his work is going to sound like it came from a think tank with an agenda, and it did not. It came from a man who spent 2 years watching the American federal government from the inside of it, and then went away and spent the next 15 years working out why the machine he had been part of behaved the way it did. The Logic of Collective Action is a short book about a boring-sounding question, and the question is this: when a group of people share an interest, will they act on it? Everybody in political science in 1965 assumed the answer was obviously yes. That was the entire foundation of the pluralist theory of politics, which had been the dominant American framework since Arthur Bentley in 1908 and David Truman in the 1950s. Society is a field of groups. Groups form around shared interests. They push against each other. Policy is the resultant of the pushing. Farmers organize because farmers have common interests. Consumers organize because consumers have common interests. The system balances. Olson's book demolished that in about 140 pages, and the demolition rests on a single observation that is so simple it is almost insulting. If a group wins something, the thing it wins is usually shared by everyone in the group, whether or not they helped. Tariff protection for the steel industry protects every steel producer, including the one that refused to pay the lobbying bill. A union wage settlement raises the wage for everyone in the shop, including the man who never went to a meeting. The benefit is collective. The cost of getting it is individual. Therefore, the rational individual member does not contribute. He lets the others do it and takes the benefit anyway. And if every rational member reasons that way, nobody contributes, and the group that supposedly has this enormous common interest sits there and does absolutely nothing, Forever, Olson's sentence for it was blunt. Unless the number of individuals in a group is quite small, or unless there is coercion or some other special device to make individuals act in their common interest, rational. Self-interested individuals will not act to achieve their common or group interests. The consequence is the part that matters, and it inverts everything that political science had assumed. Size is not strength. Size is weakness. A small group can organise because each member's share of the prize is large enough to be worth the effort, and because in a small group everybody can see whether you contributed. A large group cannot organise because each member's share of the prize is trivially small, and his individual contribution makes no perceptible difference to whether the group wins. The larger the group, Olson wrote, the less it will further its common interests, which means that in any society, the groups that succeed in extracting things from the political system are not the ones with the most people or the most legitimate grievance. They are the ones small enough to organise. And the groups that lose, permanently, structurally, in every country, in every era, regardless of the form of government, are the enormous diffuse ones. Taxpayers, consumers, tenants, patients, people who do not have a job yet, people who have not been born yet. He gave it a name that I have never been able to get out of my head since I first read it. The Exploitation of the Great by the Small. That book made him famous inside economics and inside political science, and it sat there for 17 years as a theory about groups. It was a beautiful piece of reasoning about lobbies and unions and cartels, and why the National Association of whatever always seems to get its way. But a theory about groups is not a theory about nations. And what Olson did next was to ask a question that nobody in his field had thought to ask, which is what happens to a country when these things do not go away. The Rise and Decline of Nations came out from Yale University Press in 1982 with the subtitle Economic Growth, Stagflation, and Social Rigidities. It was reviewed by Douglas North, who would later win a Nobel Prize for Economic History, and by Robert Keir-Hahn, and by Gordon Tullock. It was eventually translated into 11 languages. It is, along with the earlier book, the reason Olson is probably the only economist alive or dead to have written 2 solo books that are both considered foundational in the same field. The move he makes in it is 1 sentence long, and everything else in the book is consequence. The move is this: distributional coalitions do not dissolve. Once a group has organised itself, once it has an office and a staff and a legal budget and a list of members and a relationship with a committee chairman, it does not disband when it has won. It stays. It defends. It expands its remit. It outlives its founders and its original purpose, and quite often the industry it was formed to represent. Organising is hard, which is the whole point of the first book, but staying organised is comparatively easy. The barrier is at the front door. Therefore, in a society that stays stable, the number of these organisations only goes in one direction, not because anybody plans it, not because of a conspiracy, because organisation is a ratchet. Every year of peace, every year of stable borders, every year in which contracts are enforced and courts function and nobody's assets get seized by a foreign army, is another year in which a few more groups clear the organising hurdle and then never leave. The stock accumulates, it compounds, and the rate of accumulation is highest in exactly the conditions we all want, because those conditions are what make the long, patient, expensive work of organising worth doing in the first place. Olson laid out the consequences as a numbered list of 9 logical implications, and they sit on page 74 of the book, and I want to give you the ones that carry the weight. Stable societies with unchanged boundaries tend to accumulate more collusions and organisations for collective action over time. Small groups have disproportionate organisational power, and that disproportion diminishes with time but never disappears. On balance, these organizations reduce efficiency and aggregate income in the societies where they operate, and they make political life more divisive. They slow down a society's capacity to adopt new technologies and to reallocate resources in response to changing conditions, and thereby reduce the rate of economic growth. They make decisions more slowly than the individuals and firms they are composed of. They have crowded agendas and crowded bargaining tables. And they more often fix prices than quantities. Once they are big enough to succeed, they become exclusive, and they work to limit the diversity of income and values among their own membership. And their accumulation increases the complexity of regulation, the role of government, and the complexity of understandings, and it changes the direction of social evolution. That last one is doing a lot of work, and we are going to spend a long time on it later. He called the resulting condition institutional sclerosis, and the metaphor is medical and deliberate. Sclerosis is the hardening and narrowing of a vessel by accumulated deposit. Nothing is attacking the artery. Nothing has invaded. The material building up on the wall arrived there through the ordinary functioning of the body, one layer at a time over decades, and each individual layer is far too thin to notice. The organism does not get sick. The organism gets slow, and the moment you can feel it is very late in the process. Now I want to do the arithmetic with you, because this is the load-bearing part of the whole theory and it almost never gets explained properly, and once you see it you cannot stop seeing it in the news. Take an organised group that represents, say, 1% of a national economy, a trade association, a licensing board, a union in a single sector, any coalition whose members' combined income is roughly 1/100th of national income. That group is deciding whether to push for something, a tariff, a licensing rule, a subsidy, a restriction on a competing technology, a rule that says only members of this group may perform this task. Whatever it is, it will move some money toward the group, and it will impose some cost on the economy as a whole through the inefficiency it creates. The group captures 100% of the gain. The group bears 1% of the loss. Work that through. It means the coalition will rationally fight for a measure that destroys up to $100 of national income in order to move $1 into its own pocket, because 99 cents of every dollar of damage lands on strangers. It is not being greedy in any unusual sense. It is not behaving badly by the standards of any organisation anywhere. It is doing exactly what every board of directors and every executive committee in every country is constituted to do, which is to serve its members. The damage is not a side effect of the coalition failing at its job. The damage is what doing the job well looks like from the outside. Make the group smaller, and it gets worse in a straight line. A coalition representing 1/10 of 1% of the economy will rationally impose $1,000 of national loss to capture $1, which is a fairly precise description of a professional licensing board. And this is where Olson does the thing that makes him better than the people who came after him and flattened his argument into a slogan. He says the mechanism reverses when the coalition gets large enough. He calls it encompassingness. If an organisation is large enough to represent, say, half the workers in a country, then it bears half the cost of any damage it causes. Push for a wage settlement that wrecks the economy, and half the wreckage lands on your own members. At that point, the organisation's interest and the society's interest start to converge, and the organisation begins to behave, in Olson's words, as though it had an incentive to make the society in which it operates more prosperous, and to redistribute toward its members with as little excess burden as possible. This is why the theory is not, and never was, an attack on organised labour, and this is misconception number 1, and I want to kill it here rather than let it sit. If Olson's argument were an anti-union argument, then the most heavily unionised countries in Europe should have been the sickest ones. In 1982, Sweden and Austria had union density that would look like science fiction to an American, and centralised peak bargaining organisations that negotiated for essentially the entire labour force at once, and both of them were performing fine. Olson's framework predicts that, and predicts it for a specific reason, which is that a union representing 80% of a workforce is an encompassing organisation and internalises the damage it does. Britain's problem was never that it had strong unions. Britain's problem was that it had too many of them. By the late 1970s, the British industrial landscape contained well over 100 separate unions, organised by craft rather than by industry, which meant that a single shipyard or printing plant could contain a dozen or more separate bargaining units, each defending a different boundary. This produced the phenomenon that British managers spent the 1970s complaining about in language that sounds invented, which is the demarcation dispute. Which trade is permitted to drill a hole? Which trade is permitted to move the drill to where the hole is? Whether an electrician may touch a pipe? Whether a plumber may touch a wire? On Fleet Street, the newspaper printing trade sustained working practices so baroque that men drew wages under invented names, and the practice was so institutionalized it had a nickname, which was Spanish practices. None of these unions was large enough to bear any meaningful share of the damage. Each one was a distributional coalition of exactly the size the arithmetic warns you about. West Germany, by deliberate design, went the other way. When the German Trade Union Federation was founded in 1949, it organised the entire German workforce into about 16 industrial unions, and the number later consolidated further. One union per industry, not one per craft. That structure was not an accident of German culture. It was chosen, in the wreckage, by people who had watched the fragmented union movement of the Weimar Republic tear itself apart, and it was permitted by an occupation government that had just finished dismantling every other organised interest in the country, and therefore had a blank sheet to work on. Hold on to that phrase. A blank sheet. It is going to come back, and it is going to get much darker every time it does. Britain, in the winter of 1978 into 1979, lost 29.5 million working days to strikes. It was the worst year for industrial action since the general strike of 1926. Gravediggers stopped burying the dead. Refuse collectors stopped collecting refuse, and it piled up in Leicester Square. Hospital porters picketed hospitals. This was the country that had won the war, at the end of the third decade of its victory. Now, here is the objection you should be forming, and it is the right objection, and I am not going to dodge it. Every one of those British stories is anecdote. Britain had 100 other things wrong with it. Imperial overhang, a chronically overvalued currency, chronic underinvestment, a class system that kept engineers out of boardrooms, an education system that produced classicists instead of production managers. You can tell any story you like about Britain after the fact. That is not evidence. That is narrative. Olson knew it, which is why the second half of The Rise and Decline of Nations does something that most grand theories of history never attempt, and which is the reason this book still gets taught while Spengler and Toynbee sit unread on the same shelf. He made it testable. He proposed that if the theory is right, then the age of a society's institutions should predict its growth rate, not its wealth, not its culture, not its resources. The number of uninterrupted years its organisational layer has had to accumulate. And he pointed out that this generates predictions that are easy to falsify, because if you find fast-growing old stable societies and slow-growing recently shattered ones in any quantity, the theory is dead. Then he went and looked inside the United States, which is a much better natural experiment than comparing countries. Because American states share a currency, a language, a federal legal framework, a labour market, and a border-free internal economy. which strips out most of the variables that ruin international comparisons. And the pattern he found was that the older the state in terms of settled institutional continuity, the slower the growth. The states of the old Northeast, which had had the longest continuous period to build up their occupational associations and their regulatory apparatus and their local guilds, grew slowest. The newer states grew fastest. He also made an argument about the American South after the Civil War, which is one of the parts of the book he later revised, and I will come back to that because how a man handles being wrong about his own evidence tells you something about whether to trust the rest of it. But the American state data was not the finding that made people sit up. The finding that made people sit up was what happened when other economists, some of them hostile, went and tested the international version. In 1983, 1 year after the book appeared, Yale University Press published a volume edited by Dennis Mueller called The Political Economy of Growth, and the entire purpose of the volume was to find out whether Olson was talking nonsense. The lead empirical chapter was written by an economist named Kwang Choi, and Choi did something that sounds crude and turns out to be devastating. He built an index of institutional sclerosis by counting, for each country, the number of years since what he called the consolidation of modernizing leadership. For Britain, he dated it to 1649. For the United States, 1776. For France, 1789. Then he correlated that number against mid-20th century growth rates. The relationship held. Older institutional stock, slower growth across the sample. Now, that measure is crude, and it is arbitrary, and the choice of start dates is contestable, and every critic of Olson has said so at length, and they are correct to say so. Choose different dates, and you can move the result. This is a real weakness, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Here is what makes it hard to dismiss anyway. The volume that published Choi's confirmation also published, a few pages later, a chapter by Moses Abramovitz arguing the opposite. Abramovitz is one of the most respected growth economists of the 20th century, and his chapter made the convergence case, which is that Germany and Japan grew fast because they were behind the technological frontier and catching up to it, and that this alone explains the post-war pattern without any need for stories about interest groups. Yale printed the confirmation and the refutation in the same book next to each other in 1983, and then let everybody fight about it for 40 years. And they fought about it. Eric Weed ran cross-national tests through the mid-80s. Peter Murrell, who was Olson's own colleague at Maryland, tested the theory against the comparative structure of British and West German manufacturing and trade, which is about as direct a test of the specific mechanism as anybody has managed. John Wallace and Wallace Oates published a paper in Kiklos in 1988 with the title, and I am quoting it because the title is the whole question. Does economic sclerosis set in with age? They tested it on American states. In 2007, 25 years after the book, an economist named Jack Heckelman published a survey in the Southern Economic Journal that went through the entire accumulated testing literature and asked what the record actually showed. The answer was that the record showed general support for institutional sclerosis, and that this support was constant across the dimensions of methodology, outlet, authorship, and timing. That sentence is doing something specific, and I want to make sure it lands. It means the result does not depend on which statistical technique you use. It does not depend on which journal published it. It does not depend on whether the author liked Olson or disliked him. And it does not depend on when the study was done. That is a stability profile that most findings in social science do not have. A great deal of what economics believed in 1982 has since evaporated. This did not. And now I want to tell you what the same survey found in the same paragraph, because this is the moment where the story changes from an academic dispute into something else. The profession accepted the mechanism and refused the corollary. Heckelmann's observation was that economists continue to reject the implication that economies grow faster after coups, revolutions, invasions, and occupations, even though that implication follows directly from the theory they have been confirming for a quarter of a century. The mechanism is accepted. The thing the mechanism implies is treated as unpublishable. I want to be careful here, because there is a cheap version of this observation and a serious one, and the cheap version is conspiracy. The serious version is that there is no career in that sentence, no grant for it, and no chair endowed for it. What there is above all is no political constituency anywhere on the spectrum willing to hold it. A conservative cannot use it, because it says that stability and continuity and tradition are the incubator of the disease. A progressive cannot use it, because it says that the organised representation of workers and professionals and communities is the mechanism of the disease. A nationalist cannot use it, because it says the strongest nations are on the longest clock. Nobody owns this finding. It sits in the literature, tested and confirmed and cited in 10,000 papers, and it never makes it into a single political speech, in any country, in any decade. That is not suppression in the sense of somebody stopping it. That is worse, because there is nobody to blame and no door to kick down. The finding is sitting in the open, and the reason you have never heard it is that no organised group has any reason to carry it. Which, if you have been paying attention, is precisely what Olson's first book predicted would happen to any idea whose beneficiaries are large and diffuse. The theory eats itself, and it eats itself in exactly the way it predicts. Now let me give you the honest case against, because the audience for this deserves it, and because a theory this large should not be handed to you without its strongest objections attached. Objection 1 is convergence, and it is Abramowitz's, and it is serious. Poor countries grow faster than rich ones when they are catching up, because copying an existing technology is cheaper than inventing one. Germany and Japan in 1950 were far below the American frontier. Britain was closer to it. Some substantial part of the growth gap is explained by that alone, and later work by Robert Barrow on conditional convergence made the mechanism much more precise. Anyone who tells you the post-war miracles were purely an institutional story is overselling. Objection 2 is that Olson's key variable is soft. The age of a society's institutional stock is not a thing you can read off a meter. It is a judgment call about start dates, and different judgment calls give different answers. And there is a real risk that researchers pick the dates that produce the result they expect. That is a legitimate methodological complaint, and it has never been fully answered. Objection 3 is the deepest one, which is that the theory is difficult to falsify in practice. If a stable country grows fast, an Olsonian can say its coalitions have not accumulated far enough yet. If a stable country grows slow, that is sclerosis. A theory that survives both outcomes is not being tested. Before I get to the strongest counterexample, I owe you the thing I promised earlier, which is what Olson did about the part of his own book that did not hold up. In the 1982 text, he argued that the American South, having had its institutional structure smashed by the Civil War and by Reconstruction, should have shed its accumulated coalitions and grown faster afterwards. It is exactly the same argument as West Germany, run on a region instead of a country. The problem is the timing. The South did eventually converge on the rest of the United States, spectacularly. But the convergence really got moving in the middle of the 20th century, which is 3 generations after the war that was supposed to have caused it. Critics pointed this out, and they were right to. Olson conceded it. In print, in a follow-up published the year after the book, he acknowledged that the Southern growth surge arrived too late to be explained purely by wartime institutional destruction, and he adjusted the claim rather than defending it. That sounds like a small thing, and it is not. Compare it to how the cyclical theorists behave when their timelines fail, which is to move the timeline. A man who publishes a large ambitious theory of national decline is shown that one of his supporting cases has the wrong dates and concedes the case in print within 12 months, is doing something structurally different from prophecy. It is the same behaviour, incidentally, that Shea and Moretti displayed when their housing estimate turned out to be wrong. You should update toward people who do this and away from people who do not, and it should have nothing to do with whether you like their conclusions. There is a second thing I owe you before the Swiss problem, which is what happened to the encompassing organisations that were supposed to be the built-in defence. Sweden and Austria were Olson's living proof that dense organisation is survivable if it is centralised enough. A peak union federation bargaining for most of a national workforce internalises most of the damage it does, and therefore behaves. That was true, and it was true for decades, and the Nordic and Austrian growth records of the post-war era are the evidence. Watch what happened to it. Swedish centralised bargaining fractured across the 1980s and 1990s as individual sectors, particularly engineering and the public sector, calculated that they could do better negotiating separately than accepting the national settlement. Which they could. Each defection was rational for the group that made it. And every defection reduced the encompassingness of what remained, which increased the incentive for the next group to defect, which reduced it further. Encompassingness is not a stable state. It is a peak that a society can occupy for a few decades on the way down. The arithmetic that makes a large coalition behave responsibly is the same arithmetic that makes each of its component parts want to leave, because a small group breaking away captures all of its own gains and bears almost none of the damage. The defence contains the instructions for its own dismantling. That is the point at which I stopped being able to read this material as an argument about policy. Olson did not describe a problem with a solution that societies keep failing to implement. He described a system in which the only known stable defence decays by the operation of the same rule that creates the disease into the disease. The best single piece of counter-evidence is Switzerland, and Olsonians have been arguing about it since the book came out, and the Müller volume contains a whole chapter on it by Franz Lehner. Switzerland has not been invaded since Napoleon. It has not had a revolution, a coup, a defeat, an occupation, or a redrawn border in the entire period covered by the theory. Its institutional continuity is the longest in Europe. It should be a fossil. It is one of the richest countries on the planet. The Olsonian answer is that Switzerland has 3 coalition dissolving features that almost nowhere else combines. Extreme federalism, which pushes decisions down to cantons small enough that a captured cantonal rule can be escaped by moving 15 miles. Direct democracy, which lets a diffuse and unorganised majority overturn a deal cut by an organised minority, which is the only mechanism ever invented that lets a latent group act without organising first. And extreme openness to trade, which means a Swiss cartel cannot raise prices because a German or Italian competitor will simply sell into the gap. I find that answer partly convincing and partly convenient. Partly convincing because those 3 features are exactly the ones the theory says should matter, and they were not invented after the fact to save it. They are in the 1982 text. Partly convenient because it is the kind of explanation you can always reach for. I am telling you, I am not fully satisfied by it. I do not think anybody should be. But now put Switzerland to one side and look at the list of countries that have unambiguously shed a heavy coalitional load in the last 200 years, and look at how they did it. West Germany, 1945. Total military defeat, foreign occupation, national partition, and the physical destruction of most major cities. Japan, 1945. Total military defeat, foreign occupation, 2 atomic weapons, and the confiscation of the rural property system. France after 1789. Revolution, terror, the abolition of the guilds and the corporations by statute, and 25 years of war. The former Warsaw Pact states, 1989. The collapse of an entire political and economic order. South Korea and Taiwan in the post-war decades. Land reform imposed under authoritarian governments in the shadow of war and occupation. That is the list. That is the complete, honest, empirical list of large national resets, and every single entry on it is a catastrophe. There is not one case on that list where a wealthy, stable, sovereign, democratic country looked at its own accumulated load and decided, deliberately, in peacetime, through its own institutions, to remove it. That absence is the shape of the whole problem, and I am going to keep coming back to it, and I want you to notice now that it has never once been filled. Before we go further into the mechanism, I need to clear away something that is going to contaminate everything if I leave it, and this is the second misconception, and it is the reason a lot of intelligent people bounce off this material. This is not a cyclical theory of history. Olson is not Spengler. He is not Toynbee. He is not John Glubb and his Fate of Empires. And he is not any of the modern investors who have repackaged that material into charts about the rise and fall of reserve currencies. Those frameworks say that civilizations pass through stages the way a person passes through youth and age, that decline is a matter of vitality or virtue or moral fibre draining away, and that the cycle is fated. None of them proposes a mechanism you could measure. None of them makes a prediction that could fail. Olson's argument has no fate in it, and no vitality in it, and no moral decay in it at all. It has an accounting identity. A group with 1% of the income bears 1% of the damage. That is the whole engine. Everything else in 200 pages is consequence and evidence. It generates numerical predictions about growth rates, and it has been tested against data for 4 decades, and it could have died at any point in those 4 decades, and it did not. And it is not alone in the literature either, which is the thing that should really unsettle you, because 3 other traditions arrived at the same place from completely different directions in the same 15-year window. Gordon Tullock, in 1967, published a paper on the welfare costs of tariffs and monopolies and theft, which pointed out that economists had been measuring the cost of monopoly wrong for a century. They had been counting the distortion in prices and quantities. Tullock said, the real cost is the resources burned in the fight over who gets the monopoly. Lawyers, lobbyists, campaign contributions, executives' time. That expenditure produces nothing, and it can consume the entire value of the prize. In 1974, Ann Kruger gave the behavior its name in a paper in the American Economic Review titled The Political Economy of the Rent-Seeking Society. She estimated the value of rents created by government restriction in India at around 7.3% of national income, and in Turkey, from import licensing alone, at something in the region of 15% of national income. Her Turkish fieldwork produced one detail I have never forgotten, which is that because export subsidies were paid by weight, exporters were loading stone into shipments and throwing it overboard once they were out of the harbour. And in 1971, George Stigler published The Theory of Economic Regulation in the Bell Journal and gave us the sentence that every regulator has spent 50 years trying to disprove, which is that as a rule, regulation is acquired by the industry and is designed and operated primarily for its benefit. 4 separate research programs. Different countries, different methods, different politics. All of them arriving at the same structure, which is that organised concentrated interests systematically defeat unorganised diffuse ones, and that the accumulated result is a drag on everything. None of that is fringe. All of it is peer-reviewed. 2 of those 4 people have Nobel Prizes, and Olson would very likely have had one if he had lived another decade, which is a sentence that is going to acquire a different weight by the end of this. The question is what it looks like now, not in 1982. Now, start with the monks. St. Joseph Abbey sits on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain in Covington, Louisiana. The Benedictines there had supported themselves for decades by selling timber off their land, and in 2005 Hurricane Katrina came through and took the trees. They needed a new income. They had a wood shop. They had been building simple cypress caskets for their own dead for more than a century. Plain boxes, no lining, no chrome, no upsell, and they decided to start selling them to the public for a few $100s apiece. The Louisiana State Board of Embalmers and Funeral Directors informed them that selling a casket in the state of Louisiana without a funeral director's license was a crime, carrying fines and the possibility of jail time. To obtain that license, the monks would have had to build a funeral home with a layout parlour for 30 people, install embalming equipment they would never use, and put a licensed funeral director on staff to sell a wooden box. The board that issued this order had 9 members. 8 of them were funeral industry professionals. The monks sued. It went to the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals, and in 2013 the court found for the Abbey, and the opinion is worth reading because the judges could not locate a public health rationale for the rule anywhere. Louisiana does not require a casket for burial. Louisiana does not regulate the design or construction of caskets. Louisiana does not even require that the casket be used. The only thing the state regulated was who was permitted to sell one. That is the mechanism live in the 21st century in a wealthy democracy with functioning courts and a free press, and it took years of litigation by a public interest law firm to remove a single rule affecting a handful of monks in one state. Now, multiply it. In the early 1950s, fewer than 5% of American workers needed a government license to do their job. The most cited modern figure, from the work of Morris Kleiner and Alan Kruger, published in the Journal of Labor Economics in 2013 and reproduced in a White House report in 2015, puts it at about 25% licensed at state level and around 29% once you include local and federal licensing. 1 in 4 American workers now requires the state's permission to work. 2 generations ago it was 1 in 20. And when you ask what happened, the answer is never that a new danger appeared. Hair has not become more dangerous. Interior design has not become more lethal. What happened is that in each of those occupations, at some point, a group of existing practitioners got organised enough to walk into a state legislature and ask for a rule, and the people who would be excluded by that rule were not in the room. Because the people who would be excluded by that rule did not know they existed yet as a group. They were students. They were immigrants. They were people who had not yet thought about that career. There is no association of people who might have become a florist. Here is the tell that this is not about safety, and I want to put it as directly as I can. More than 800 occupations are licensed in at least one American state. Only a small handful are licensed in all of them. If licensing tracked genuine public risk, that list would be nearly identical across states, because the physics of a hairdryer does not change when you cross the Mississippi. Instead, the list varies wildly, and the variation tracks nothing except which trades in which states happen to organize successfully and when. South Carolina licenses about 12% of its workforce. Iowa licenses about 33%. Same country, same technology, same hazards, nearly 3 times the difference. And the training requirements are where it gets difficult to keep a straight face. The Institute for Justice has been publishing surveys of this for over a decade, and the comparison that keeps surfacing is the one between cosmetology and emergency medicine. In most states, the license to cut and style hair requires something on the order of a year of full-time training. The license to arrive in an ambulance, assess a person in cardiac arrest, and keep them alive on the way to hospital requires roughly a month. Consider what a state is actually asserting when it writes those two numbers into law. It is asserting that a badly done haircut requires 12 times the preparation of a badly done resuscitation. Nobody sat down and decided that. Nobody wanted that outcome. It is the residue of two separate organising histories, one of which had a large, well-funded, long-established trade association pushing for higher entry requirements over many decades, and one of which did not. The wage effect is real, and it runs about 18%, which is to say licensed practitioners earn roughly 18% more than they otherwise would. That premium is not conjured out of nothing. It is paid by every customer who buys the service, and it is paid most heavily by the people who buy the most services relative to their income, which is the poor. And the cost is paid a second time by everyone who is now not doing that job at all. And then there is the effect nobody predicted, which shows up in the work of Jana Johnson and Morris Kleiner, which is that licensing reduces the rate at which people move between states. If your license does not travel, you do not travel. A nation that spent 2 centuries being defined by the fact that its people could pick up and move to where the work was, has been quietly building millions of small legal walls between its own states, one occupation at a time. You can watch this show up in the aggregate numbers, and this is where it stops being a collection of infuriating anecdotes and becomes a measurable condition of the whole system. The startup rate, meaning the share of all American firms that are less than a year old, was 13.7% in 1978. By 2020, it was 8.4%. The share of employment sitting in firms less than 5 years old fell from about 14% in 1982 to around 9% by 2018. Firms 5 years old or younger made up close to half of all American businesses in the early 1980s. By 2010, they were under 35%. The economy is getting older, not the workers. The firms, and the rate at which workers move between jobs and between firms and between states has been falling for 4 decades alongside it. Economists call this declining business dynamism and declining labour market fluidity, which are dry names for something that is not dry at all. What those numbers describe is an economy in which fewer new things are tried, fewer old things die, and fewer people change their situation. That is precisely, word for word, Olson's implication number 7. They slow down a society's capacity to adopt new technologies and to reallocate resources in response to changing conditions. He wrote that in 1982, when American startup rates were still near their peak, and the decline had barely begun. Now look at the stock of rules itself, because this is the part that is easiest to verify and hardest to explain away. The Code of Federal Regulations, which is the compiled body of American federal regulatory law, ran to somewhere under 10,000 pages in 1950. In 2019, it stood at 185,984 pages. Page counts are a soft measure, so the Mercatus Center at George Mason University built a better one. They wrote software to count the actual restrictive terms in the text. Shall, must, may not. Required, prohibited. Every place where the federal government tells somebody they have to do something or cannot do something. In 1970 there were about 406,000 such restrictions. By 2018 there were roughly 1.09 million. The full text runs to something over 103 million words. To put that in a shape you can hold, a person reading 40 hours a week at the speed of an average adult reader would need something over 3 years to read the American Federal Regulatory Code once, by which time a substantial portion of it would have changed underneath them. And the federal workforce employed to write and enforce those rules went from about 57,000 people in 1960 to something over 277,000 by 2017. I want to be fair here, because there is a version of this argument that is dishonest and I am not making it. A modern industrial economy is more complicated than the economy of 1950. Some of that growth is genuinely necessary. Air is cleaner. Rivers do not catch fire. Workplaces kill far fewer people. Products that used to maim children do not. I am not going to stand here and pretend that the regulatory state produced nothing, because it produced a great deal, and some of it saved lives that are walking around today. The argument is not that rules are bad. The argument is about the ratchet. Look at the shape of the accumulation rather than its content. Almost none of it has an expiry date. Almost none of it is subject to automatic review. There is no institution anywhere in the American federal system whose job is to remove regulation the way agencies exist to create it, and no diffuse constituency capable of demanding one. Every single rule in that 1.09 million has a specific organized group that benefits from it and will fight to keep it, and a diffuse, unorganized population that pays for it in fragments so small that no individual will ever notice enough to act. That asymmetry does not produce bad rules, it produces permanent ones. And permanence, compounded across 70 years, is the entire disease. Which brings us to the industry that exists purely to work that asymmetry. American federal lobbying expenditure was around $1.45 billion in 1998. In 2024, it hit a record of about $4.4 billion. The single largest spender that year was the National Association of Realtors, at something over $86 million. The United States Chamber of Commerce has spent more than $700 million on federal lobbying since 2015 alone. And that $4.4 billion is only the part that is legally required to be disclosed. It does not capture the trade press, the funded institutes, the sponsored research, the conference circuit, the revolving door, or the enormous quantity of persuasion that takes place in rooms where nobody is registered as doing anything. Ask yourself what kind of return an organization has to be getting to make that expenditure rational. These are not charities. Every dollar of that $4.4 billion was approved by somebody who expected it to come back multiplied. There are estimates in the academic literature of returns on specific lobbying campaigns that run into the thousands of %, and I want to flag honestly that the most famous of those numbers, drawn from a study of a corporate tax repatriation provision, has been disputed on methodology, and I would not build a case on it. You do not need it. The revealed preference is enough. $4.4 billion a year is what the market price of access looks like when access works, and every dollar of that is a dollar not spent making anything. That is Tulloch's insight, arriving 57 years later at national scale. The cost of a captured system is not only the distortion it creates, it is the entire industry that grows up around the capture, staffed by some of the most capable people in the country, none of whom are producing a good or a service or a discovery. There is one more aggregate measure worth putting on the table before we go looking at concrete, and I am going to present it with more hedging than the others, because the profession is genuinely fighting about it, and I would rather show you the fight than pick a side. In 2020, Jan de Lecker, Jan Eekhout, and Gabriel Unger published a paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics estimating how much American firms charge above their own marginal cost. Their headline finding was that the average markup rose from around 21% above marginal cost in 1980 to around 61% by 2016, and that the average profit rate over the same period went from about 1% to about 8%. If that is right, it describes an economy in which the ability of firms to hold a price above what competition would allow has roughly tripled in a generation, which is what an Olsonian would predict a country to look like after 40 more years of accumulation. It is contested. Seriously contested. One line of criticism argues that the method misclassifies overhead and administrative spending, and that once you account for it properly, the increase largely disappears. A published comment argues that the result is highly sensitive to sample restrictions that were not reported, and that dropped something like 27% of available observations, and that the remaining effect is driven substantially by finance and insurance firms rather than by the economy at large. Alternative ways of aggregating the same underlying data produce increases in the range of 12 to 23% rather than a tripling. My honest summary is that something rose and the magnitude is unresolved. I would not build a case on the headline number, and I am not going to. The measure I find harder to argue with is a comparison, and it comes from Thomas Philippon, a French economist at New York University, who published a book in 2019 called The Great Reversal. He has said the question that started it was an ordinary one. He had moved from France to the United States and wanted to know why his American mobile phone bill was so much larger than the one he used to pay in Europe. The answer he found, after years of work, was that at some point around the turn of the century, the two continents swapped positions. American markets in the 1990s were more competitive than European ones, which is the received wisdom nearly everybody is still carrying. By the 2010s, on a range of measures, European markets had become the more competitive ones. Between 2000 and 2017, average prices rose noticeably faster in the United States than in Europe. American broadband costs roughly double what European consumers pay for comparable service, and the explanation Philippon offers is one that fits Olson so precisely it is almost uncomfortable. European competition enforcement was constructed at the level of the European Union, which is to say at a level above the one at which national industries had spent a century organising themselves. A French champion that had captured the French regulator found itself facing a Brussels authority it had no relationship with, no history in, and no purchase on. The competition regulator was placed outside the reach of the coalitions by an accident of institutional design, and it stayed effective for as long as that distance held. I should say that Philippon's work has its own critics, including researchers who argue that American concentration has been roughly flat for 2 decades, and that his airline and broadband comparisons do not survive closer analysis. That argument is live, but the shape of his claim is the one worth carrying out of this section. Competition policy works when it sits somewhere the incumbents cannot reach. That is not a moral observation about Europeans or Americans. It is a geometric one about where you put the referee. Now I want to take you into the places where you can actually see the accumulated weight, physically, in the world, in concrete and steel, because so far this has all been percentages, and percentages let you keep your distance. The 2nd Avenue subway in New York City opened its first phase on the first day of 2017. 3 stations. 1.8 miles of track. The final cost was around $4.45 billion, which works out at roughly $2.5 billion per mile. The Transit Costs Project, run out of the Marin Institute at New York University by Alon Levy and Eric Goldwyn, has spent years assembling a database of hundreds of urban rail projects across dozens of countries in order to find out whether that number is normal. It is not normal. It is the most expensive urban rail construction on the planet by a wide margin. Paris builds metro tunnels for something in the region of $160 million a mile. Madrid, which has one of the best cost records in the world, comes in around $320 million. Copenhagen is similar. A typical major subway project outside the United States lands somewhere between $250 and $450 million per mile. New York is paying between 6 and 15 times what comparable rich democracies pay for the same hole in the same kind of ground. And the next phase of the same line is currently projected at something over $4 billion per mile, which is to say the number is not stabilizing, it is still climbing. Now, when you ask what accounts for the difference, the honest answer is that it is not one thing, and everybody involved will tell you it is somebody else's fault. And that in itself is the finding. It is staffing levels on tunnel boring machines that run several times European norms under work rules negotiated decades ago. It is station designs inflated by requirements from agencies that have no responsibility for the budget. It is the procurement rules, the insurance structure, the consultant layers, the environmental review process, the utility relocation negotiations, the community mitigation agreements, and the sheer number of separate bodies that each hold a veto and none of which hold the schedule. That last item is the one worth naming properly. Francis Fukuyama gave it a word in 2014, and the word is Vetocracy, and it describes a system that has accumulated so many separate points at which an action can be blocked that it has lost the ability to act at all without anyone ever having decided to remove that ability. Count the veto points on any large American infrastructure project, and then remember what a veto point is in Olson's terms. It is a place where a small organized group can impose a cost on a large diffuse one. Every one of those points was created for a defensible reason. Every one of them protects somebody real from something real. And their sum is a country that cannot build a subway. California put a high-speed rail bond on the ballot in 2008. The proposition told voters the San Francisco to Los Angeles system would cost about $33 billion and carry passengers by the early 2020s. Current estimates for the full system run well over $100 billion. The timeline has moved repeatedly, and the project has been scaled back to a segment in the Central Valley running between Merced and Bakersfield. The same country built the Hoover Dam in 5 years during the Great Depression. The same country built the Empire State Building in about 1 year and 45 days. The Pentagon, which is one of the largest office buildings on Earth, went from groundbreaking to occupancy in 16 months during a war. The engineering did not get harder. The concrete did not get heavier. What got heavier is everything sitting on top of the concrete. The clearest place to watch this happening in real time is the electricity grid, because the grid is where a country's stated intentions collide with its actual capacity to act. And the collision is documented annually. Every generator that wants to connect to the American grid has to join an interconnection queue, which is the process by which a regional operator studies whether the new plant can be attached without destabilizing the network. The study is necessary. Nobody is arguing that you should be able to bolt a power station onto a grid without anyone checking. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory publishes a report on the state of those queues every year, and the numbers in it are difficult to read as anything other than paralysis. There are now something on the order of 2,600 gigawatts of proposed generation and storage capacity sitting in American interconnection queues waiting for permission. For scale, the entire installed generating capacity of the United States is roughly 1,200 gigawatts. The waiting room contains more than twice the size of the existing power system. The median time from filing an interconnection request to actually operating has roughly doubled over the past decade to something around 5 years. And the great majority of projects that enter the queue never get built at all. They expire in it. And the transmission lines that would carry the power, the high voltage backbone that moves electricity from where it is cheap to generate to where people live, have effectively stopped being built at any meaningful scale in the United States, while other countries continue to build them. A major interstate line now takes somewhere between 10 and 15 years to develop, if it survives, and most of that time is not construction. It is review, litigation, easement negotiation, and the accumulation of separate approvals from separate authorities, any one of which can stop it. A major environmental impact statement, the deepest tier of federal environmental review, has been taking around 4.5 years on average to complete. That is the average, not the tail. The tail runs to a decade and beyond. Now, the law that created that review process was passed in 1970 in response to a genuine and appalling record of highways driven through neighbourhoods, rivers used as industrial sewers, and communities that had no legal standing to object to anything done to them. It was a correction of a real injustice, and it worked. The people who wrote it were not building a weapon. What they were building was a procedural right of objection with no counterweight, and once that right existed, it became the most valuable asset in American infrastructure, because it can be held by anybody, exercised for any reason, and asserted without ever having to state the real one. A group opposing a wind farm for aesthetic reasons files on habitat. A competing energy interest opposing a transmission line files on process. A homeowners association opposing housing files on traffic studies. The stated ground does not have to be the actual ground, and the delay is the win regardless of the outcome, because a project delayed past its financing window is a project that dies without anybody ever having voted against it. The environmental review process is now used more often against clean energy projects than against fossil fuel ones, which is not what anybody intended in 1970, and is exactly what the theory predicts. The rule was captured by whoever benefits from stopping things, and who benefits from stopping things changes with a decade, while the rule does not. And now, I want to do something that will either build your trust in everything else in this script, or destroy it, and I would rather find out now. There is a famous number in this area of research. In 2015, Chang Tai-Sheh and Enrico Moretti circulated a working paper arguing that housing supply restrictions in a handful of high-productivity American cities, chiefly New York, San Francisco and San Jose, had lowered aggregate American economic growth by something like 36% between 1964 and 2009. The logic was that workers who would have moved to the most productive places in the country to do the most productive work were priced out by the refusal of those places to permit housing, and the entire national economy was smaller as a result. That figure went everywhere. It is one of the most cited statistics in the housing debate. It was wrong. The economist Brian Kaplan flagged apparent errors. The authors checked, and to their considerable credit they confirmed the problem and corrected it. In the version published in the American Economic Journal in 2019, the estimate is that relaxing constraints in those 3 cities would have raised American gross domestic product by around 3.7%, or roughly $3,685 per worker. That is a different claim, measured differently, and it is an order of magnitude smaller than the number that went viral. And even that revised figure has since been challenged in a published comment, arguing it remains far too large. I am telling you this for 2 reasons. The first is that I would rather hand you the corrected number and lose the impact than hand you the impressive one and have you find out later. The second is that 3.7% of the output of the largest economy in human history, foregone permanently, is still an enormous quantity of destroyed value produced by nothing more than the accumulated preferences of people who already owned houses in 3 metropolitan areas. And that is what makes housing the purest example in the entire theory. There is no villain. There is no cartel headquarters. There is a large number of individually reasonable homeowners who attend local meetings, because they live there, because they have time, because the value of their single largest asset depends on the outcome, and because the meeting is a 15-minute drive away. And against them there is the group that would have moved into the housing that does not get built. A group which cannot attend the meeting, cannot be polled, cannot be organised, and cannot be identified even in principle, because its members do not yet know they are members. The great, defeated by the small, with no law-breaking anywhere in the process. Compare Tokyo, which sets its zoning at national level rather than local, which strips the veto out of the hands of the immediate neighbours, and which has for decades issued housing permits at rates that make Californian numbers look like a rounding error in a metropolitan area with more people than the entire state of California. Now let me take you into medicine, because this is the one where the cost is not measured in dollars. In 1910, Abraham Flexner published a report for the Carnegie Foundation on the state of medical education in the United States and Canada. He had visited and evaluated 155 medical schools, and a great many of them were genuinely appalling. Diploma mills operating without laboratories or hospital access or entrance standards. The report is one of the foundational documents of modern American medicine, and much of what it recommended was correct and necessary. Within roughly 25 years, the number of American medical schools had fallen to about 66. Of the 7 medical schools then training black physicians, 5 closed, and only Howard and Meharry survived. A decision whose consequences for American health outcomes are still being measured over a century later. The American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education was the driving institutional force behind the implementation. Raising standards and restricting entry were, in this case, the same action, and I want to be precise about that, because it is the hardest and most important thing in this entire subject. Quality control and cartel formation are frequently indistinguishable from the inside, and the people doing them usually cannot tell the difference either, and neither can you at the time. Then, in 1997, the Balanced Budget Act capped the number of medical residency positions that Medicare would fund at each hospital's existing level. Because residency is the mandatory bottleneck through which every American physician must pass, that cap set a national ceiling on the production of doctors. That ceiling stayed effectively in place for about 24 years. It was not adjusted through 2 decades of population growth, aging, and rising demand. In 2021, Congress finally added 1,000 slots, spread over several years, into a system that trains tens of thousands. The result is visible in the raw counts. The United States has around 2.7 practicing physicians per 1,000 people. The average across comparably wealthy nations is about 3.8. Since the year 2000, physicians per capita in peer countries have grown by roughly a third. In the United States, the figure has grown by around 14%. That gap is not an abstraction. It is measured in how long you wait, what you pay, whether there is a doctor in the rural county you live in, and in some number of cases which nobody can calculate precisely, but which is certainly not zero, whether somebody dies waiting. The organisations involved did not want that. I want to be very clear that no professional body sat in a room and decided to produce a physician shortage. They wanted standards, and they wanted stable incomes, and they wanted a manageable pipeline. And each of those is a normal thing for a professional association to want. The shortage is the residue, and the residue is always where the damage lives. Nobody chooses it. It accumulates. Here is one where somebody did the arithmetic explicitly. The United States sugar program restricts imports and supports domestic prices, which means American food manufacturers pay more for sugar than their competitors anywhere else. In 2006, the United States Department of Commerce published a study on employment in American food manufacturing, which concluded that for every 1 job saved in sugar growing and harvesting, nearly 3 jobs were lost in confectionery manufacturing, and that the annual cost per job saved was about $826,000. Read that again. The policy is a net destroyer of employment in the food industry, and the jobs it does save cost more than $800,000 each per year, paid by everybody who eats. It has survived every administration of both parties for decades. It survives because a few thousand sugar producers are organised, funded, geographically concentrated in politically significant places, and know exactly what the policy is worth to them, and because the cost to you personally is somewhere around $10 or $20 a year, buried inside the price of things you were going to buy anyway. Nobody has ever spent a Saturday afternoon campaigning about $10. Nobody ever will. That is not apathy. That is arithmetic. Olson's arithmetic, working exactly as specified, for the better part of a century. Then there is the case where you can watch a coalition die in real time, which almost never happens, and is worth studying because of how it happened. A New York City taxi medallion, which is the transferable license permitting one vehicle to pick up street hails, cost around $1.3 million in 2013. The supply had been essentially frozen for decades. Drivers and investors borrowed against medallions at those prices because the restriction looked permanent. And it looked permanent because it had been permanent for 70 years. Then a technology arrived that the existing rules had not anticipated and could not immediately capture. By March of 2017, a medallion sold for $241,000. That is what a rent looks like when it evaporates. And I want to be careful about how this gets told, because it is usually told as a story about disruption and innovation, and it is also a story about immigrant drivers who had put their life savings and their family's savings into an asset whose value was created by a regulation and destroyed by a regulator's inability to enforce one. Several of them killed themselves. The coalition broke, and the people crushed under it when it fell were not the ones who built it. The lesson the incumbents took from that decade was not that restrictions are fragile. The lesson they took was that restrictions need to be written to cover technologies that do not exist yet. Which is exactly what happened at the ports. At 1 minute past midnight on the 1st of October, 2024, around 45,000 members of the International Longshoremen's Association walked off the job at 36 ports along the east and Gulf coasts of the United States. It was the first strike that union had called since 1977, and it stopped a substantial share of American container traffic within hours. The wage demand was enormous, opening at something like 77% over the life of the contract. But the wage was not the part that mattered, and both sides knew it. The central demand was a complete prohibition on automation and semi-automation at the ports. Not a limit, not a negotiated transition with retraining and attrition, a ban on the machinery itself. The strike was suspended after 3 days under considerable political pressure. A tentative agreement was reached in January of 2025, and the membership ratified a 6-year contract by a margin close to unanimous the following month, with wage increases of about 62% and language governing automation that the union described as protecting its jurisdiction. Now, I want to be careful and fair, because it is easy to sneer at dock workers from a desk. These are physically dangerous jobs. The people doing them have watched other industries automate and watched the gains flow almost entirely to owners, while the displaced workers were told to learn something else and then abandoned. Their skepticism about promises of retraining is grounded in about 40 years of those promises being broken. If I were them, I would want that clause too. That is exactly the point, and it is the point that people who use Olson as a political weapon always miss. Every distributional coalition in this entire story is composed of people with a genuine interest, a real grievance, and in most cases a defensible moral claim. The monks were being extorted by a funeral board, but the funeral directors who wrote that rule believed they were protecting grieving families from predatory sellers. The homeowners blocking apartments believe they are protecting a neighbourhood. The medical associations restricting entry believe they are protecting patients. The dock workers believe they are protecting families from a machine that does not care about them. None of them is lying. That is why this cannot be fixed by exposing anybody. Meanwhile, the ports of Rotterdam and Shanghai and Singapore ran their automated terminals through all of it. The cost of the American clause is not paid by the union or by the terminal operators. It is paid in a slightly slower, slightly more expensive supply chain, forever, by 340 million people who will never know the clause exists. The same shape repeats everywhere you look once you have the pattern. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which everyone calls the Jones Act, requires that goods shipped between two American ports travel on vessels that are American-built, American-owned, American-flagged, and American-crewed. The stated purpose was national security and a domestic shipbuilding industry. A century later, the American commercial shipbuilding industry is a shadow. The qualifying fleet is small and old, and the cost falls hardest on the places with no alternative, which is to say the islands. Estimates of the annual cost to Puerto Rico alone run to well over $1 billion, and national estimates vary so widely between researchers that I would not quote a single figure with confidence. What is not disputed is that it has survived for 106 years through every conceivable political configuration because a small, concentrated, geographically distributed coalition of shipbuilders, operators and maritime unions cares about it enormously and nobody else knows it exists. Roughly 36 American states operate certificate of need laws in healthcare, under which a hospital or clinic wishing to add beds, open a facility, or buy a piece of major equipment must first prove to a state board that the community needs it. In many of those states, existing providers are permitted to intervene in the proceeding and argue that the community does not. Read that again as well. The law formally invites the incumbent competitor into the room to object to the arrival of a competitor. It is the sort of arrangement that would be a criminal antitrust conspiracy if two companies agreed to it privately, and it is administrative law when a state writes it down. Most American states prohibit or restrict manufacturers from selling cars directly to the public, requiring sales to pass through an independent franchise dealer. Those laws were written in an era when dealers were the weak party being squeezed by Detroit, and there was a genuine imbalance to correct. The dealers won that fight in the middle of the 20th century and never disbanded, and when an electric vehicle manufacturer with no dealer network appeared decades later, the statutes were already in place, and a battle that had nothing to do with the original grievance was fought state by state and is still being fought. The American fuel supply contains a mandated quantity of corn ethanol, sustained through a federal renewable fuel standard, whose energy and environmental case has been contested by researchers for 20 years, and which is defended with total ferocity by a farming coalition concentrated in a state that happens to hold the earliest presidential nominating contest in the country. Candidates of both parties arrive in Iowa, discover a deep personal commitment to ethanol, and depart. Every one of these is small. Every one of these is defensible in its own terms by people who are not cynics. The sugar program costs you $15 a year. The dealer law costs you a few hundred on a car you buy once a decade. The ethanol mandate costs you a fraction of a cent per mile. Individually, none of them is worth 1 hour of your life to oppose. Collectively, they are the reason a country that built the Pentagon in 16 months now takes longer than that to permit a bicycle lane. And if you are sitting there thinking that this is a story about American dysfunction specifically, about a peculiar national capture of a peculiar political system, I need to take you somewhere older. Because the identical machine has run in other centuries with different technology and different religions and different forms of government, and it produced the identical outcome. Venice. Everything you know about Venice is the decline, the masks, the decadence, the beautiful rotting city, Byron and Casanova and the Republic dying of its own luxury in 1797 when Napoleon walked in and ended 11 centuries of independence without a fight. The rise is a completely different story, and almost nobody tells it. Medieval Venice was, by a distance, the most economically inventive society in Europe, and its central invention was not a ship or a navigation technique. It was a contract. The colleganza was a partnership arrangement in which a sedentary investor put up capital and a travelling merchant went to sea with it, and they split the profit on a defined schedule. What made it matter is that the travelling merchant did not need to be rich. He needed to be capable and willing to make the voyage. A young man from an unremarkable family could take somebody else's money, sail to Alexandria or Constantinople, and come back with enough to invest on his own account the next time. Venice built a machine for turning capable poor people into rich people, and it ran that machine for roughly 200 years, and it made Venice the richest state in Europe. The economists Diego Puga and Daniel Treffler documented what happened next in a paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2014. They did the kind of work that makes you understand why economic history is worth funding. They assembled a database of 8,178 men who sat in the Venetian Parliament, and nearly 7,000 recorded marriages spanning 2 centuries, and they used the movement of names into and out of the political elite as a measure of how open the society was. What the names show is a society that was extraordinarily open and then closed. The great merchant families who had made their fortunes through the colleganza gradually came to understand that the same mechanism which had lifted them was now lifting their competitors. Their response arrived in stages, and the decisive one came in 1297 with the Serrata del Maggior Consiglio, the closing of the Great Council. Membership of Venice's governing body, previously subject to election, was made effectively hereditary. If your family was in when the door shut, your descendants were in forever. If your family was out, no amount of ability or wealth or service would ever get you in. And having secured the political body, the same families then went after the economic mechanism that had created their rivals. The long-distance galley trade, the most profitable branch of Venetian commerce, was progressively restricted. The colleganza itself was eventually abolished. The state took over the galley system and allocated the routes. Venice did not stop being rich when this happened. That is the part everyone gets wrong. It stayed rich for a long time. It stayed a great power. It kept building palaces, and the palaces built during the closure are the ones tourists photograph. What Venice stopped doing was producing new people. The mechanism that had converted talent into capital was switched off deliberately by the beneficiaries of that mechanism in order to prevent it from serving anybody else. The society went from a machine for manufacturing merchants to a museum guarded by their descendants. 500 years later, a French general walked in and nobody fought. Spain ran a different version of the same thing with the Mesta, the guild of migratory sheep owners, which held royal privileges over the movement of enormous flocks across the Castilian countryside, and used those privileges for centuries to block the enclosure and improvement of arable land, because arable land is land the sheep cannot walk over. A country that had just acquired the largest empire in the world and a river of American silver spent 300 years unable to reform its own agriculture, because the interest that benefited from the existing arrangement was organised and permanently attached to the Crown's revenue, and the interest that would have benefited from the change was every peasant farmer in Castile and therefore nobody at all. And then there is the case that should frighten anybody who assumes that reaching the top of the table is protection. In 1913, Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries on the face of the earth by income per head. Not a promising developing economy, not a regional power, genuinely, measurably, among the richest societies in the world, ahead of France, ahead of Germany, in the same conversation as the United States. It had European immigration, world-class agriculture, British capital, railways, and a growth record running back 4 decades. There is no invasion in what follows, and no occupation either, and nothing that a historian would recognise as a catastrophe. No plague, no famine, no partition, no foreign conquest. Argentina simply spent the 20th century layering coalition upon coalition, protected industry upon protected industry, subsidised sector upon subsidised sector, each layer installed by a government responding to a real constituency with a real grievance, until the accumulated weight of the arrangement made ordinary economic function impossible. It is the only large country in modern history to have made the journey from the front rank to the middle of the pack without losing a war. Which means the mechanism does not need a catastrophe to finish you, it only needs a catastrophe to save you. Which leaves the question I promised to hold open, and it is time to actually try to answer it. Has a wealthy, stable, sovereign democracy ever removed a major accumulated coalition deliberately through its own institutions in peacetime, without a war or a revolution or an occupation doing it for them? Yes, once, cleanly in living memory, in the United States, and the story of how is the most useful thing in this entire subject. The Civil Aeronautics Board was created in 1938 to regulate American commercial aviation. It set fares. It decided which airline could fly which route. It decided whether new airlines could exist at all. Between 1938 and 1978, something close to 80 companies applied to the board for permission to operate as a new interstate airline. The board approved none of them, not one in 40 years. The effect on the industry was exactly what the theory predicts. Since the carriers were forbidden to compete on price, they competed on everything else, which is why air travel in the 1960s involved steak carved at your seat, free alcohol, lounges, and on some aircraft an actual piano bar. The nostalgia for that era is real, and it is also a description of a cartel dissipating its own rents on service theatre, because it was not permitted to return them to passengers as a lower fare. The fares themselves were roughly double what they would become, in real terms, and flying was something a large majority of Americans had never done. The airlines liked the arrangement. The unions liked the arrangement. The board liked the arrangement. That is 3 organised groups, and against them stood every American who might have flown somewhere and did not, which is a group that could not be assembled, could not be polled, and did not know what it was missing. And it fell anyway. It fell because of a specific sequence of events involving specific people. And the sequence is worth memorising because it is the only complete instance we have. In 1975, Senator Edward Kennedy, a liberal Democrat with no institutional stake in aviation whatsoever, ran a series of hearings through the Administrative Practice Subcommittee that he chaired. The special counsel he hired to run those hearings was a young Harvard law professor named Stephen Breyer, who would later sit on the Supreme Court. Kennedy took the subject on because it was a consumer issue, because ordinary people paid too much for tickets, and because his committee's jurisdiction over administrative procedure gave him a way in that did not require him to control the aviation committees, which he did not. That last detail is not incidental. He found a procedural door that the coalition had not bothered to guard, because the coalition had spent 40 years guarding the doors that mattered. The hearings did what hearings almost never do. They made the arrangement legible, not corrupt, not scandalous, just visible. Fair comparisons between regulated interstate routes and unregulated intrastate routes inside California and Texas, where an airline flying entirely within one state was outside the board's authority and was charging dramatically less for the same distance, in the same aircraft. The comparison did not require an economic argument, it was two numbers next to each other. Then, in 1977, President Carter appointed an economist named Alfred Kahn to chair the board. Kahn was a Cornell professor who had written the standard textbook on the economics of regulation and had come to the conclusion that most of what he had spent his career studying should not exist. He arrived at an agency whose purpose was to protect an industry and set about dismantling it from the inside. His line about the aircraft has been quoted for 50 years. He said he really did not know one plane from another, that to him they were just marginal costs with wings. The Airline Deregulation Act passed in 1978. The board itself was wound down and formally abolished in 1985, which makes it one of the very few federal agencies in American history to be legislated out of existence. Inflation-adjusted airfares are now somewhere in the region of half what they were before deregulation, depending on the measure. The number of Americans who fly has grown beyond anything the 1970s could have imagined. The Staggers Act deregulated freight rail in 1980, and the Motor Carrier Act deregulated trucking the same year, and both produced enormous, measurable, sustained falls in the cost of moving things around the United States. That happened. It is real. It is the single strongest piece of evidence that this is not a fate. Now here is why I cannot leave it there, and why every time I read about this I end up more uneasy rather than less. Look at what it took. It took a senator from the Party of Organized Labor attacking a unionized industry, using a committee whose jurisdiction was procedural rather than substantive. It took a future Supreme Court justice's staff. It took a president willing to appoint a regulator whose stated intention was to eliminate his own agency. It took the existence of an unregulated control group inside California and Texas that made the cost of the cartel visible in a single table. It took an economics profession that had spent 30 years building the intellectual case. And it took the industry itself being split, because some carriers correctly calculated they would win in an open market. 6 conditions, all present at once, aimed at one industry. There are more than 800 licensed occupations in the United States. There are 1.09 million federal regulatory restrictions. There are 36 states with Certificate of Need boards, 50 separate sets of dealer franchise laws, and tens of thousands of municipal zoning codes. At the rate of 1 Alfred Kahn per generation, the arithmetic does not work. It does not come close to working. The coalitions form faster than the reformers, because forming a coalition requires a shared narrow interest, and reforming one requires a coincidence of 6 unrelated things. And there is a second problem with the airline story that people who love it do not like to discuss. 4 carriers now control something like 80% of American domestic capacity. The industry consolidated. Slot allocation at the busiest airports, frequent flyer programs, hub structures and code sharing have rebuilt a substantial amount of what the board used to enforce, only now it is enforced by market structure rather than by statute, and it is not subject to a repeal vote. The coalition did not stay dead. It reassembled in a form that does not require a federal agency. That is the pattern I keep hitting and cannot get around. The removals are real, they are possible, and they are local, slow, expensive in political capital, and reversible. The accumulation is automatic, continuous, cheap, and permanent. One side of that ledger requires a coincidence of heroes. The other side requires only that time pass. The idea has been rediscovered recently, which is either a hopeful sign or an indication of how bad it has become, and probably both. Francis Fukuyama gave us Vetocracy in 2014, describing an American political system that has accumulated so many blocking points that it privileges anybody who wants to stop something over anybody who wants to do something. Jennifer Palka published Recoding America in 2023, from the vantage point of somebody who had gone inside federal technology procurement and watched competent people rendered useless by accumulated process, and her diagnosis is that the rules were each written to prevent a specific past failure, and their sum prevents function itself. Mark Dunkelman published Why Nothing Works in 2025, tracing how American progressivism spent the 20th century first building central capacity and then, after the highway builders and the urban renewal bulldozers, deliberately constructing the veto points that now stop it from building anything at all. And in March of 2025, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson published Abundance, which argues that scarcity in housing and energy and infrastructure is not a natural condition, but a policy outcome, chosen repeatedly through procedural rules that nobody defends in the aggregate, and everybody defends in particular. It draws directly on Olson's framework, and Klein has credited him by name. 43 years after the book came out, the argument is back in the centre of political conversation, mostly under other names. What none of them has, and what Olson did not have either, is an answer to the structural problem underneath all of it, which is that every proposed cure has to be administered by the institutions that are already captured. Using procedures the coalitions already control against opposition that is concentrated and funded on behalf of a beneficiary group that is diffuse, unorganised, and in many cases not yet born. Olson's own prescription, when he finally offered one near the end of the 1982 book, was not a program. It was a direction. He wrote that there is no substitute for a more open and competitive environment. Free trade, because a foreign competitor cannot be lobbied into compliance by a domestic cartel. Open borders to goods and to people. Competition between jurisdictions. Anything that makes it possible to escape a captured arrangement rather than having to win a vote against it. That prescription has a problem, and I think Olson knew it, and I think it is the reason his writing gets quieter and stranger at the end of his life. Openness is itself a policy. It has to be enacted and defended by the political system, and the political system is precisely the thing that the coalitions have already colonised. Telling a sclerotic society that the cure is more openness is like telling a patient that the cure for a blocked artery is more blood flow. It is true, and it is not a treatment, which is roughly where Mancur Olson found himself in the last decade of his life, having correctly described a disease for which he could not write a prescription. In a profession that had confirmed his mechanism and quietly declined to discuss what it implied, he did something that theorists almost never do. He went and tried it. In 1990, Olson founded a centre at the University of Maryland with the ungainly name of the Centre for Institutional Reform and the Informal Sector, which everyone shortened to IRIS. It was funded largely by the United States Agency for International Development, and by the late 1990s, it was running on something like $7 million a year, with over 50 staff and projects in around 20 countries. The timing was not a coincidence. Between 1989 and 1991, the entire Soviet bloc dissolved, and history handed Mancur Olson the experiment he had spent his life describing. Here were societies in which the accumulated coalitional structure had been annihilated, not damaged. Annihilated the planning ministries, the sectoral bureaucracies, the party organisations, the state enterprise directorates, the official unions. The entire lattice of organised interests that had governed economic life for 2 generations, all of it lost its legal basis and its funding and its enforcement power inside about 18 months. By the logic of 1982, that is the reset. That is Germany in 1945 without the bombing. Every one of those countries should have grown like Japan. Poland roughly did. The balsa of its reforms landed in January of 1990 with a speed and brutality that is still argued about, and Poland was back in growth within about 2 years and became the first country in the bloc to exceed its pre-collapse output. It has been one of the great growth stories of the last 30 years, and almost nobody in the West talks about it. Russia did not. Russian output fell by something in the region of 40% across the 1990s. Male life expectancy, which is the measure that cuts through every statistical dispute because corpses are hard to argue with, fell from around 64 years to around 57 by 1994. That is a collapse of a kind that normally requires a war. In 1995, the loans for shares auctions transferred the largest industrial and resource assets in the country to a small circle of men at prices that were not prices in any sense an economist would recognise. In August of 1998, the state defaulted on its own debt. Same reset. Same removal of the accumulated coalitional structure. Opposite outcome. And Olson, to his enormous credit, did not explain this away. He went back and worked out what his own theory had been missing, and the paper he produced is called Dictatorship, Democracy and Development, published in the American Political Science Review in September of 1993, and it is the most disturbing thing he ever wrote. He starts with a Chinese warlord. In the 1920s, during the collapse of central authority in China, a general named Feng Yuxiang controlled a large territory in the north and taxed the population in it heavily. He was, by any reasonable description, a bandit with an army, and Feng spent a great deal of his effort hunting and destroying other bandits, most famously a roving leader known as the White Wolf. Olson took the story from a Stanford biography of Feng, published in 1966 by the historian James Sheridan. The peasants under Feng preferred Feng, not because he was kind, and not because he took less, because he stayed. This is the distinction Olson built the rest of his life around. A roving bandit arrives, takes everything he can carry, and leaves. Since he will not be back, he has no reason to leave you anything, and you, knowing this, have no reason to plant a crop, build a barn, or accumulate anything he might want. A stationary bandit does something different. He settles. He monopolizes the theft in his territory and converts it into regular taxation. And the moment he does that, his own income depends on your production continuing next year, which means he now has a reason to protect you from other bandits, enforce contracts between you and your neighbour, and leave you enough to plant with. Olson wrote that the bandit who settles down, puts on a crown and replaces anarchy with government is the first blessing of the invisible hand. He called the thing that changes an encompassing interest, the same concept as the encompassing union from 1982, now scaled up to cover the state itself. A ruler who owns the whole territory internalizes the damage he does to it. A ruler who owns nothing does not. Now put that next to Russia in 1992. What the collapse produced was not an open society with a cleared field. It was a territory containing enormous assets, no functioning enforcement, no tax capacity, no property registry anybody trusted, and a very large number of people with the ability to seize things, and no expectation whatsoever of still being there in 10 years. It produced roving banditry at industrial scale with the physical capital of a superpower lying on the ground. Which means the thing Olson had spent his career describing as the cure has a failure mode, and the failure mode is worse than the disease. Germany and Japan did not simply have their coalitions destroyed. They had their coalitions destroyed by an occupying power that then stayed for years, wrote a constitution, ran the courts, guaranteed property, suppressed the return of the cartels by law, and had every incentive to leave behind a functioning economy. Because a functioning economy was the point of the exercise. They got the demolition and the reconstruction from the same hands. Russia got the demolition. I want to sit with what that means for the question we have been holding, because I think it is the point at which the whole thing becomes genuinely difficult rather than merely uncomfortable. We began with an observation that the countries that were destroyed outgrew the countries that were not, and a mechanism that explains why. We have watched that mechanism confirmed across 4 decades of testing, seen it operating in medieval Venice and in Castilian sheep law and in Argentine industrial policy and in a Louisiana funeral board, and we have found exactly one clean case of a wealthy democracy removing a major coalition deliberately, which required 6 unrelated conditions to coincide, and which partially reversed itself within 30 years. And now the escape route itself turns out to be conditional. The reset does not work on its own. The reset works when it is administered by an outside power with an encompassing interest in what comes afterwards, sufficient force to prevent the old arrangements from reassembling, and the patience to stay for a decade. That is the shape of the only reliable exit from institutional sclerosis that human history has produced. Be comprehensively defeated by someone competent enough to rebuild you, and lucky enough that they want to. You cannot legislate that. You cannot vote for it. You cannot build an institution that provides it. No political party in any country can put it on a manifesto. It is not a policy, and it never will be, and every serious person who has looked at this material for the last 43 years has arrived at the same wall and stopped. Olson stopped there too. The book he was working on when he died is called Power and Prosperity, and it was published in the year 2000, and it is about exactly this: how the stationary bandit becomes a state, how a state becomes a market-augmenting government, and what has to be true for property rights to be secure enough for a modern economy to function. He was, in the last years of his life, trying to write the instruction manual for building the thing that Russia did not get. He never finished it. Colleagues who saw the drafts described the manuscript as being in something like its nth revision, a document he kept opening and reworking and refusing to release. He was still working on it on the 19th of February, 1998. It was a Thursday. He had been out to lunch and had come back to the campus at College Park, and he was walking to a meeting, and he collapsed outside his own office and did not get up. He never regained consciousness. He died that day. He was 66 years old, and he had turned 66 28 days earlier. The cause was a heart attack. His father, Mancur Olson Sr., was a farmer, and he died of a heart attack at the age of 65 while operating his tractor. A brother of Olson's died of cardiac causes in his 50s. His colleague Martin Maguire, who knew him for decades and wrote a memoir about him years afterwards, described the adverse family history of heart trouble and described what Olson had done about it. He ran, he rode, he jogged, he kept up an aerobic regime for the whole of his adult life. And Maguire wrote that this lifelong commitment to fitness had seemed to promise that he would triumph over the odds. He had a mechanism he could not see, inherited, silent, accumulating in tissue he had no access to and no measurement of, doing its work through decades in which he had no symptoms and every reason to believe he was winning. He knew the risk better than anyone. He had watched it kill his father. He organised his life around outrunning it. And on an ordinary Thursday in the middle of an ordinary week, having crossed a few yards of pavement he had crossed 10,000 times, the accumulation reached the threshold at which it stops being invisible, and everything that had been true for 66 years stopped being true in under a minute. I want to be honest that this is a coincidence, and I am not going to pretend it is anything more. Arteries do not know what their owner writes about. There is no meaning in it. There is a shape in it though, and the shape is the thing I cannot put down. Because here is what Mancur Olson actually found, underneath the growth regressions, and the 9 implications, and the 4 decades of testing. And it has nothing to do with left or right, and it is not an argument against government, or an argument against unions, or an argument against anything you can vote on. What he found is that societies are killed by the accumulated weight of things that were each, individually, entirely reasonable. Every distributional coalition in this story was formed by people with a real grievance. The funeral directors of Louisiana were responding to genuine cases of families being fleeced while grieving. The American Medical Association's Council on Medical Education was responding to genuine diploma mills producing genuinely dangerous doctors. The dock workers on the East Coast were responding to 40 years of watching automation's gains flow past them. The homeowners at the zoning meeting are responding to a real fear about the largest asset they will ever own. The Venetian families who closed the Great Council were responding to a real anxiety about their children's position in a world they had built. Not one of them was wrong on their own terms. Not one of them broke the law. Almost none of them thought of themselves as extracting anything from anybody. And I want you to do something uncomfortable now, which is to run the same inventory on yourself. If you hold a professional license, that license is a wall, and there is somebody on the other side of it who would have done your job adequately and is not permitted to. If you own a home, its value depends in part on the fact that the land near you is not permitted to hold as many people as it could, and the people who would have lived in those homes are right now living somewhere worse and further away, and you have never met them and never will. If you have a pension, it is invested in incumbents. If you belong to a union, an association, a guild, a bar, a board, an order, a college, or a chartered institute, then some part of your income exists because that body successfully restricted entry into something, and it did so decades before you arrived, and you have simply inherited the position. None of that makes you a villain. It makes you a participant. Every one of those protections is something you would defend if it were threatened, and you would be right to defend it, because you built a life on top of it, and the person asking you to give it up is not offering you compensation. That is why this cannot be solved by finding the guilty party. There is no guilty party. There is a 150 million person coalition, and it is called a society, and every member of it is holding one small piece of the blockage, and every member of it is being blocked by everyone else's piece, and each individual piece is worth defending, and the sum is a country that cannot build a subway. Here is the part that should genuinely disturb you, and it is the reason this material is harder to carry than any conspiracy theory you have ever encountered. The disease has no symptom that presents as itself. There is no day on which sclerosis is in the news, no vote on it, and nothing that anybody could hold a press conference about. What it produces is a texture. Everything takes longer than it used to. Everything costs more than it should. A rail line that would have taken 4 years takes 19. A permit that took a month takes 3 years. A drug that exists in another country is not available in yours. Rent takes a share of your income that would have been unthinkable to your parents. Every individual instance has a specific local explanation involving specific named parties, and all of those explanations are true, and none of them is the cause. And because there is no visible cause, the explanation gets supplied by whoever is offering one. It is the other party. It is the generation above you who bought houses cheap and pulled the ladder up. It is the generation below you who do not want to work. It is immigrants. It is foreigners. It is bureaucrats. It is billionaires. It is the culture, the decline of religion, the phones, the schools. All of that is what a population reaches for when the actual mechanism is a rate of change in a stock that nobody measures and nobody can see, operating over a period longer than a career, produced by the ordinary functioning of institutions that everybody agrees are legitimate. This should have been the central fact of political argument in every developed country for the last 40 years, and it is not mentioned, and the reason it is not mentioned is the reason Olson gave us in 1965, before he had even thought of the second book. The beneficiaries of understanding this are enormous, diffuse and unorganized. They will never fund a campaign about it. There is no association of people who would have flown somewhere, No lobby for the buildings that did not get built, no trade body representing the businesses that were never started, no union for the doctors who were never trained, and no delegation representing the people who will be alive in the year 2090 and who will inherit whatever load we have finished stacking by then. Those groups are the largest constituency in the world, and every one of them is silent for exactly the reason Olson worked out at Harvard in his 20s, sitting in a library, working out why a group with everything to gain will sit there and do nothing at all. And now the last thing, which is the part I still do not know how to hold properly. The accumulation is fastest when everything is going well. Coalitions form during peace, because peace is when the long, patient, expensive work of organising is worth doing. They form under secure property rights, because secure property rights are what make a defended position worth holding for 50 years. They form under stable government, because a stable government is one whose committees are worth capturing. They form under the rule of law, because the rule of law is what makes a rule permanent once you have obtained it. Peace, property, stability, law, those are not incidental to the disease. They are the growth medium. They are the four things every human society has ever tried to build. And they are the exact conditions under which the load accumulates fastest, and there is no known way to have the first four without the fifth. Which means the feeling that everything is basically fine is not evidence against any of this. It is the condition the mechanism requires. Mancur Olson spent 35 years describing a process that is silent, that compounds during the good decades, that produces no symptom until the symptom is structural, and that has never once been reversed at national scale by a healthy society acting deliberately upon itself. Then he crossed a few yards of pavement on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and the thing that had been accumulating quietly inside him for 66 years finished its work. The book was still open on the desk upstairs. The mechanism did not stop when he did. It is running right now, in your country, this afternoon, in a zoning hearing attended by 11 people, in a licensing board where 8 of the 9 members work in the industry the board regulates, in a markup on a bill nobody read, adding a clause nobody will ever repeal. Nothing that happens today will be worth your attention. Nothing ever is. That is not a flaw in the design. That is the design. And the years in which it grows fastest are the years in which nothing appears to be wrong at all. You are living in them.